Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to Grand Teton. The first thing I'd like you to do is please imagine that on this very spot, only 150,000 years ago, we would be standing underneath 2,000 feet of ice. To put that into perspective, we would have to stack 7 Statues of Liberty on top of one another just to reach the surface. Hi, everybody. My name's Todd. And that 2,000 feet of ice and its glacier and its impact on this environment and how it has created this landscape is what we're going to talk about today. As we stand here in the Teton Valley with the Grand Teton behind me, it has taken millions of years to create what you see here today. From colliding tectonic plates to volcanic eruptions, this place has seen it all. But today we're here to talk about the glaciers and how they change the landscape. If you look anywhere on the ground here in the valley, just about any rock you find is going to be smooth and round, just like these. Now, if you can imagine that 2,000 feet of ice grinding along the surface, it's easy to understand how these rocks came to be. But those are just a small example of what glaciers can do. On our walk around Taggart Lake today, you're going to see firsthand the power that glaciers have. I'm going to explain to you why you see trees in some areas and none in others. Finally, when we get next to the lake, we're going to put it all together. You're going to understand how these lakes got here. So follow me, folks. Our first stop is just around the corner. Welcome to our first stop. I'd like you to take a good look at this boulder. First impression, its size. It's just a little larger than the other rocks I showed you when we were down in the valley. This granite boulder has been sitting here for about 20,000 years. No one's going to be moving it anytime soon. Second, look at its shape. Just like the rocks in the valley, this boulder is devoid of any sharp corners and has been ground into this round shape. Now, unlike the rocks I showed you in the valley, this boulder was actually carved out of a canyon that you see behind me. It's estimated that this boulder has traveled about 5 miles from deep within the canyon to where it sits today. The glacier that moved this rock is the same glacier that carved that canyon and down into the valley and created Taggart Lake. Traveling that distance under all that ice and pressure, it's no wonder why it's taken this shape. This boulder is also very distinct. If you notice, there's no other boulders around it that look quite like it. Because it's composed of granite, it's a much harder rock and is able to withstand that much pressure. Majority of the Tetons is made up of a variety of limestone and gneiss, a much softer rock. Most of those rocks were ground up into much smaller pieces because they didn't have the ability to withstand all that pressure. Now, make no mistake, this boulder started out much larger than how it sits today. But after thousands of years, it's a testament to how hard granite rock really is. This rock was just the first example of how powerful a glacier can be and its ability to shape the landscape. Let's head down around the corner and see something even more amazing that glaciers can do. All right, guys, we've done a bit of climbing since we began, and there's a reason for that. As you can see, we're on a little bit of a slope. Just down below is this Taggart Lake. This slope is no accident. We're actually standing on what's called a moraine. A moraine is simply defined as a mass of rock and sediment that is carried down and deposited by a glacier. So how'd this moraine get here? Well, if you look behind me, you can see the mouth of Avalanche Canyon. Avalanche Canyon was carved out over thousands of years by an advancing glacier. Now, the leading edge of the glacier does a lot of the hard work, and that's where a lot of that debris resides. Once the glacier stops advancing and begins to melt and recede, it deposits that debris in place. Because of the size of this moraine, it may be difficult to imagine. But look at this image here. This is Schoolroom Glacier, located back behind the Grand Teton. It's aptly named the Schoolroom Glacier simply because it's a textbook example of what a glacier does. Now, you can see what's left of the glacier here. Now, it has been receding for many decades, but you can see that at one time, it was advancing down the hillside and gouging out this void. Now, as it gouged out the void, it displaced all that material around it and created this wall, and that's a moraine. So as the glacier melted and receded, the runoff water filled this void and created this small lake. Every lake in Grand Teton was created in this manner, and Taggart Lake is no exception. Now, there are a few more interesting things about the moraine, but let's head down to the lake and see how it all comes together. Welcome to Taggart Lake. Well, we've descended about 100 feet or so down off the moraine and are now standing on the shoreline of Taggart Lake. From this vantage point, we have an excellent view of Avalanche Canyon. Now, Avalanche Canyon is one of the several canyons here within Grand Teton that has been carved out by glaciers over the past several thousand years. Canyons that have been carved by glaciers have one very distinct characteristic. It's that roundish U appearance that they have. If you look at the mouth of Avalanche Canyon, you can see that rounded U appearance. In contrast, what is called V-shaped canyons. Now, V-shaped canyons are those canyons that have been eroded over thousands of years by water. The Grand Canyon, with its very steep walls, is an excellent example of a V-shaped canyon. I did mention that there are several canyons within the park that have been carved out by glaciers. If you look at this image here, this is Cascade Canyon, looking down Cascade Canyon at the Grand Teton. You can see that very distinct U shape. So, as we look into the mouth of Avalanche Canyon, hopefully you can imagine seeing a massive glacier advancing down the canyon, driving into the valley floor, creating this void, pushing all of that debris out around us here. Just like I showed you with the image of Schoolroom Glacier that deposited all of that debris around us on these moraines. And just like the Schoolroom Glacier, as the glacier started to melt and recede, all of that meltwater filled this void and created Taggart Lake. Now, I mentioned at our last stop there are some other interesting aspects to moraines. As you know, the moraines contain all of the debris that was displaced by the glacier. And that includes one important substance, and that's soil. Glaciers, as they advance, carry those boulders, cobbles, and gravel and grind it up into a flour. As glaciers melt, they deposit that flour and that rocky debris in the moraine. This fine-grained material helps soils form, and so it can retain moisture, which allows trees to grow. This is the reason why every lake in Grand Teton is surrounded by conifer and aspen trees, much like you see here. As another example, if you look at this aerial image of Jenny Lake, which is about a mile north of us here, you can see the outline of the conifer and aspen trees around Jenny Lake. In contrast to the valley where we started our trip, the glacier meltwater carried away all those fine sands and silts that would have retained moisture and allowed topsoil to form. Now, sagebrush, which is well adapted to dry soil, now dominates the valley. It's this lack of topsoil that explains why the valley is almost void of trees. Now, let's continue along the shoreline and head back over the moraine to the trailhead where we could wrap this all up. All right, folks, I hope you have enjoyed your walk with me today. Along our journey, you saw firsthand the small example of the power of glaciers and how they can move large boulders over several miles. You now know how they carved these canyons, created this landscape, and basically shaped the landscape we see here today. From the lodgepole pine-covered moraines to the sagebrush-filled valleys, glaciers have done it all. Now I want to thank you for joining me here today. I hope as you visit Grand Teton and enjoy the beautiful sights, you have a little better understanding of what created this landscape. Thank you very much.